And here I go again. Sam. Now, remember that name. That is quite important. I think he is one of the most intelligent thinkers alive today. He is a philosopher, a neuroscientist, and a critic of religion, and a spokesman for humanism and reason. And that is why I have been listening to his podcasts in the background when I've been painting this painting, because taking in knowledge, rational thinking, at the same time as I can paint and do what I love, is probably one of my biggest pleasures in life. And being able to take in enormous amount of data and knowledge while doing these things are just living an amazing life. I would urge you to listen to what Sam Harris has to say. You will find him on YouTube. Everywhere, debates about science, about reason, about death, about life, about practically everything. So, now, this is a smaller painting, so I can't really go into detail, but I really like this. It's not often I really like something that much, but I mean, I really feel that I made something nice here. There's always some part of my painting that I like more than other parts, and I guess that head there is what does it for me in this painting. You never know how it's going to turn out. This turned out quite well. So I will post a video of the whole process with Sam Harris talking about science, meditation, religion, Islam, tribalism, everything that is important to understand, to have any idea of what is actually going on in the world. Yeah. And as I always say, share it with your friends. You can add me on Facebook if you send me a personal message and like one of my pages and stuff like that. And if you don't, I will ignore you, because I want to know who the hell I'm adding as a friend. Yeah. Okay. I'm actually nice guy, so. Sam Harris. Okay. Have a good one.
I wanted to do another Ask Me Anything podcast, but I know I'm going to get inundated with questions about my conversation with Noam Chomsky. So in order to inoculate us all against that, or at least to make those questions more informed by my view of what happened there, I want to do a short podcast just dealing with the larger problem, as I see it, of having conversations of this kind. More and more, I find myself attempting to have difficult conversations with people who hold very different points of view. And I consider our general failure to have these conversations well so as to produce an actual convergence of opinion and a general increase in goodwill between the participants. I consider this the most consequential problem that exists. Apart from violence and other forms of coercion, all we have is conversation with which to influence one another. And the fact that it's so difficult for people to have civil and productive discussions about things like U.S. foreign policy or racial inequality or religious tolerance and free speech, this is profoundly disorienting, and it's also dangerous. If we fail to do this, we will fail to get everything else of value. Conversation is our only tool for collaborating in a truly open-ended way. So I've been experimenting by reaching out to people to have difficult conversations. I recently did this with the Muslim reformer Maajid Nawaz, which resulted in a short book entitled Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which will be published in the fall. And as you'll read in that book, this was not at all guaranteed to work. Maajid and I had a very inauspicious first meeting. But when I later saw the work he was doing, I reached out to him, and the resulting conversation is one in which we made genuine progress. He opened my mind on several important points. And most important, it was a genuine pleasure to show readers that conversation, even on very polarizing topics, can occasionally serve its intended purpose, which is to change minds, even one's own. Now here I would draw a distinction between a conversation and a debate. They're superficially similar when the parties disagree, but to have one's mind changed in a debate is to lose the debate, and very likely to lose face before one's audience. Now this is an incredibly counterproductive way to frame any inquiry into what is true. Now occasionally I engage in public debates, but I've never approached them like a high school exercise where one is committed to not changing one's view. I don't want to be wrong for a moment longer than I need to be. And if my opponent is right about something and I can see that, I will be very quick to admit it. So my dialogue with Maajid was not a debate, really, even though at times we are pushing rather hard against one another. It was rather a conversation. And on the heels of that success, I decided to attempt a similar project with Noam Chomsky. And the results of my failure are on my blog for all to see. Of course, many people understood exactly what I was trying to do and why I published the exchange, and they apparently appreciated my efforts. I tried to have a civil conversation on an important topic with a very influential thinker, and I failed. And I published the result because I thought the failure was instructive. But the whole purpose was to extract something of value from what seemed like a truly pointless exercise. But that's not the lesson that many readers took away from it. Now, many of you seem to think that the conversation failed because I arrogantly challenged Chomsky to a debate, probably because I was trying to steal some measure of his fame, and that I immediately found myself out of my depth. And when he devastated me with the evidence of my own intellectual misconduct, and my ignorance of history, and my blind faith in the goodness of the U.S. government, I complained about his being mean to me and I ran away. Well, I must say, I find this view of the situation genuinely flabbergasting. Many of you seem to forget that I published the exchange. And you must think I'm a total masochist or just delusional. Now, I know that some of you think the latter. I heard from one person, I think it was on Twitter, who said, Sam Harris reminds me of a little kid who thinks he's playing a video game and he thinks he's winning, but his controller isn't actually plugged in. Now, I happen to love that metaphor. I'm just not so happy to have it applied to me. But anyone who thinks I lost a debate here just doesn't understand what I was trying to do, or why, upon seeing that my attempt at dialogue was a total failure, I bailed out. I really was trying to have a productive conversation with Chomsky, and I encountered little more than contempt and false accusations and highly moralizing language, accusing me of apologizing for atrocities. And then weird evasions and silly tricks. It was a horror show. Now, I concede that I made a few missteps. I should have dealt with Chomsky's charges that I had misrepresented him immediately and very directly. They are, in fact, tissue thin. I did not misrepresent his views at all. I simply said that he had not thought about certain questions when I should have said he had thought about them badly. Those of you who have written to tell me that what I did to Chomsky is analogous to what has been done to me by people who actually lie about my views, you're just not interacting honestly with what happened here. I did not misrepresent Chomsky's position on anything. And insults aside, he was doing everything in his power to derail the conversation. And the amazing thing is that highly moralizing accusations work for people who think they're watching a debate. I mean, they convince most of the audience that where there's smoke, there must be fire. I mean, for instance, when Ben Affleck called me and Bill Maher racist, that was all he had to do to convince 50% of the audience. But I'm sorry to say, it was the same with Chomsky. I can't tell you how many people I heard from who think that he showed how ludicrous and unethical my concern about intentions was, for instance. He's dealing in the real world, but all my talk about intentions was just a bizarre and useless bit of philosophizing. But think about that for a second. Okay, our legal system depends upon weighing intentions in precisely the way I described. How else do we differentiate between premeditated murder and crimes of passion and manslaughter and criminal negligence and just terrible accidents for which no one is to blame? Imagine your neighbor's house burns down and yours with it. Okay, what the hell happened? Okay, well, what happened has a lot to do with your neighbor's intentions. Okay, if he had a cooking fire that got out of control, that's one thing. If he tried to burn down his own house to collect the insurance payment, that's another. If he tried to burn down the whole neighborhood because he just hates everyone, that's another. Okay, intentions matter because they contain all the information about what your neighbor is likely to do next. Okay, there's a spectrum of culpability here, and intention is its very substance. Chomsky seems to think that he has made a great moral discovery in this area, and that not intending a harm can sometimes be morally worse than intending one. Now, I'm pretty sure that I disagree, but I would have loved to discuss it. I wasn't debating him about anything. I was trying to figure out what the man actually believes. It's still not clear to me, because he appeared to be contradicting himself in our exchange. But in response to my questions and the thought experiments I was marshalling trying to get to first principles, all I got back were insults. But worse, many people seem to think that these insults were a sign of the man's moral seriousness. I mean, many seem to think that belligerence and an unwillingness to have a civil dialogue is a virtue in any encounter like this, and that simply vilifying one's opponent as a moral monster by merely declaring him to be one is a clever thing to do. Now, despite what every Chomsky fan seems to think, there was nowhere in that exchange where I signaled my unwillingness to acknowledge or to discuss specific crimes for which the U.S. government might be responsible. The United States and the West generally has a history of colonialism and slavery and of collusion with dictators and of imposing its will on people all over the world. I have never denied this. But I'm hearing from people who say things like, of course, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are terrible, but we're just as bad, worse even, because we created them, literally. And through our selfishness and our ineptitude, we created millions of other victims who sympathize with them for obvious reasons. We are, in every morally relevant sense, getting exactly what we deserve. Well, this kind of masochism and misreading of both ourselves and of our enemies has become a kind of religious precept on the left. I don't think an inability to distinguish George Bush or Bill Clinton from Saddam Hussein or Hitler is philosophically or politically interesting, much less wise. Okay, and many people, most even, who are this morally confused, consider Chomsky their patriarch. And I suspect that's not an accident. But I wanted to talk to him to see if there was some way to build a bridge off this island of masochism so that these sorts of people, who I've been hearing from for years, could cross over to something more reasonable. And it didn't work out. The conversation, as I said, was a total failure, but I thought it was an instructive one. So, I don't know if that answers all the questions I'm going to get about the Chomsky affair, but when I put out a call for an AMA later this week, forgive me for moving on to other topics, because I don't think there's much more to say on this one. But I'm going to keep trying to have conversations like this, because conversation is our only hope. If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can discuss it on your own blog or podcast. Or you can help fund it directly. And there are two ways you can do this. You can try membership at Audible, the world's leading source of audiobooks, at audibletrial.com/Sam Harris. Or you can make a donation through my website at samharris.org/donate. I wanted to do another Ask Me Anything podcast, but I know I'm going to get inundated with questions about my conversation with Noam Chomsky. So in order to inoculate us all against that, or at least to make those questions more informed by my view of what happened there, I want to do a short podcast just dealing with the larger problem, as I see it, of having conversations of this kind. More and more, I find myself attempting to have difficult conversations with people who hold very different points of view. And I consider our general failure to have these conversations well, so as to produce an actual convergence of opinion and a general increase in goodwill between the participants. I consider this the most consequential problem that exists. Apart from violence and other forms of coercion, all we have is conversation with which to influence one another. And the fact that it's so difficult for people to have civil and productive discussions about things like U.S. foreign policy or racial inequality or religious tolerance and free speech, this is profoundly disorienting, and it's also dangerous. If we fail to do this, we will fail to get everything else of value. Conversation is our only tool for collaborating in a truly open-ended way. So I've been experimenting by reaching out to people to have difficult conversations. I recently did this with the Muslim reformer Maajid Nawaz, which resulted in a short book entitled Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which will be published in the fall. And as you'll read in that book, this was not at all guaranteed to work. Maajid and I had a very inauspicious first meeting. But when I later saw the work he was doing, I reached out to him, and the resulting conversation is one in which we made genuine progress. He opened my mind on several important points. And most important, it was a genuine pleasure to show readers that conversation, even on very polarizing topics, can occasionally serve its intended purpose, which is to change minds, even one's own. Now here I would draw a distinction between a conversation and a debate. They're superficially similar when the parties disagree, but to have one's mind changed in a debate is to lose the debate, and very likely to lose face before one's audience. Now, this is an incredibly counterproductive way to frame any inquiry into what is true. Now, occasionally I engage in public debates, but I've never approached them like a high school exercise where one is committed to not changing one's view. I don't want to be wrong for a moment longer than I need to be. And if my opponent is right about something and I can see that, I will be very quick to admit it. So my dialogue with Maajid was not a debate, really, even though at times we are pushing rather hard against one another. It was rather a conversation. And on the heels of that success, I decided to attempt a similar project with Noam Chomsky. And the results of my failure are on my blog for all to see. Of course, many people understood exactly what I was trying to do and why I published the exchange, and they apparently appreciated my efforts. I tried to have a civil conversation on an important topic with a very influential thinker, and I failed. And I published the result because I thought the failure was instructive. But the whole purpose was to extract something of value from what seemed like a truly pointless exercise. But that's not the lesson that many readers took away from it. Now, many of you seem to think that the conversation failed because I arrogantly challenged Chomsky to a debate, probably because I was trying to steal some measure of his fame, and that I immediately found myself out of my depth. And when he devastated me with the evidence of my own intellectual misconduct and my ignorance of history and my blind faith in the goodness of the U.S. government, I complained about his being mean to me and I ran away. Well, I must say, I find this view of the situation genuinely flabbergasting. Many of you seem to forget that I published the exchange. And you must think I'm a total masochist or just delusional. Now, I know that some of you think the latter. I heard from one person, I think it was on Twitter, who said, Sam Harris reminds me of a little kid who thinks he's playing a video game and he thinks he's winning, but his controller isn't actually plugged in. Now, I happen to love that metaphor. I'm just not so happy to have it applied to me. But anyone who thinks I lost a debate here just doesn't understand what I was trying to do, or why, upon seeing that my attempt at dialogue was a total failure, I bailed out. I really was trying to have a productive conversation with Chomsky, and I encountered little more than contempt and false accusations and highly moralizing language, accusing me of apologizing for atrocities, and then weird evasions and silly tricks. It was a horror show. Now, I concede that I made a few missteps. I should have dealt with Chomsky's charges that I had misrepresented him immediately and very directly. They are, in fact, tissue thin. I did not misrepresent his views at all. I simply said that he had not thought about certain questions when I should have said he had thought about them badly. Those of you who have written to tell me that what I did to Chomsky is analogous to what has been done to me by people who actually lie about my views, you're just not interacting honestly with what happened here. I did not misrepresent Chomsky's position on anything. And insults aside, he was doing everything in his power to derail the conversation. And the amazing thing is that highly moralizing accusations work for people who think they're watching a debate. I mean, they convince most of the audience that where there's smoke, there must be fire. I mean, for instance, when Ben Affleck called me and Bill Maher racist, that was all he had to do to convince 50% of the audience. But I'm sorry to say, it was the same with Chomsky. I can't tell you how many people I heard from who think that he showed how ludicrous and unethical my concern about intentions was, for instance. He's dealing in the real world, but all my talk about intentions was just a bizarre and useless bit of philosophizing. But think about that for a second. Okay, our legal system depends upon weighing intentions in precisely the way I described. How else do we differentiate between premeditated murder and crimes of passion and manslaughter and criminal negligence and just terrible accidents for which no one is to blame? Imagine your neighbor's house burns down and yours with it. Okay, what the hell happened? Okay, well, what happened has a lot to do with your neighbor's intentions. Okay, if he had a cooking fire that got out of control, that's one thing. If he tried to burn down his own house to collect the insurance payment, that's another. If he tried to burn down the whole neighborhood because he just hates everyone, that's another. Intentions matter because they contain all the information about what your neighbor is likely to do next. Okay, there's a spectrum of culpability here, and intention is its very substance. Chomsky seems to think that he has made a great moral discovery in this area, and that not intending a harm can sometimes be morally worse than intending one. Now, I'm pretty sure that I disagree, but I would have loved to discuss it. I wasn't debating him about anything. I was trying to figure out what the man actually believes. It's still not clear to me, because he appeared to be contradicting himself in our exchange. But in response to my questions and the thought experiments I was marshalling trying to get to first principles, all I got back were insults. But worse, many people seem to think that these insults were a sign of the man's moral seriousness. I mean, many seem to think that belligerence and an unwillingness to have a civil dialogue is a virtue in any encounter like this, and that simply vilifying one's opponent as a moral monster by merely declaring him to be one is a clever thing to do. Now, despite what every Chomsky fan seems to think, there was nowhere in that exchange where I signaled my unwillingness to acknowledge or to discuss specific crimes for which the US government might be responsible. The United States and the West generally has a history of colonialism and slavery and of collusion with dictators, and of imposing its will on people all over the world. I have never denied this. But I'm hearing from people who say things like, of course ISIS and Al-Qaeda are terrible, but we're just as bad, worse even, because we created them, literally. And through our selfishness and our ineptitude, we created millions of other victims who sympathize with them for obvious reasons. We are, in every morally relevant sense, getting exactly what we deserve. Well, this kind of masochism and misreading of both ourselves and of our enemies has become a kind of religious precept on the left. I don't think an inability to distinguish George Bush or Bill Clinton from Saddam Hussein or Hitler is philosophically or politically interesting, much less wise. Okay, and many people, most even, who are this morally confused, consider Chomsky their patriarch. And I suspect that's not an accident. And I wanted to talk to him to see if there was some way to build a bridge off this island of masochism so that these sorts of people who I've been hearing from for years could cross over to something more reasonable. And it didn't work out. The conversation, as I said, was a total failure, but I thought it was an instructive one. So I don't know if that answers all the questions I'm going to get about the Chomsky affair, but when I put out a call for an AMA later this week, forgive me for moving on to other topics because I don't think there's much more to say on this one. But I'm going to keep trying to have conversations like this because conversation is our only hope. Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Today I'm going to talk about cults, mostly. I've been in a cultish frame of mind in the last week, getting over bronchitis, so my apologies for my voice being even raspier than it usually is. But I've been paying attention to cults for some reason, and I've focused on two cults that have been around for a while, Heaven's Gate and Scientology. I recently saw the film Going Clear, based on Lawrence Wright's book by that name. And the book is well worth reading. The film is really a devastating takedown of Scientology. I can't imagine it won't do the organization lasting harm if enough people see it. It exposes how goofy L. Ron Hubbard was and how sinister his organization soon became under him and his successors. So do see that film. It's playing on HBO and had some theatrical release as well. But I've mostly been thinking about the Heaven's Gate cult, which, as you might recall, about 18 years ago, came to the world's attention because 39 members, including the chief member, a man named Marshall Applewhite, who was known as Doe to his devotees, all took their lives in a mansion near San Diego. They all donned identical pairs of Nikes and drank a cocktail of phenobarbital and vodka, I believe, and then got in their bunk beds and covered themselves with purple shrouds and departed, they imagined, for a spaceship that was following in the tail of the comet Hale-Bopp. So this was a rather horrifying and peculiar news item. I think it remains the largest mass suicide in U.S. history, although I recall my reaction to it at the time was a little bit less than reverential. I remember sitting on my couch watching this first footage that came out of this house of everyone in their bunk beds with their Nikes and hearing the voiceover announcer say, and in their freezer they had nothing but quart after quart of Starbucks Java chip ice cream. And I remember sitting on my couch alone and saying out loud to myself, wait a minute, Starbucks makes ice cream? And then I leapt to my feet and drove straight to the supermarket and bought some Starbucks Java chip ice cream. So I guess we all draw from certain tragedies the lessons we need at the time. Obviously, I've become more sympathetic with the plight of these people in the intervening years and more interested in the phenomenon of cults, and have drawn other lessons from this one. In any case, the most fascinating thing about Heaven's Gate is that the members of this class, as they called it, left final video testimonies as to why they were doing what they were doing and how satisfied they were to be doing it. And this is, of course, analogous to the video testimonies one often gets from jihadist suicide bombers. But these were people who were really aware of how inscrutable their behavior was going to seem to their loved ones and to the rest of the society in which they were living. And they really made their best effort to defend their actions, if not explain them, and to simply bear witness or demand that the world bear witness to the psychological fact that they were absolutely unconflicted in doing what they were doing. They just felt immense gratitude for the experience of living for decades with their other cult members with whom they had formed an obvious bond, and for the guidance of Do and T, the woman who had been his partner, who had died a decade earlier. And these were people who, for the most part, were clearly happy and approaching their deaths with genuine enthusiasm. They were gleeful about the prospect of departing this world and arriving elsewhere in the galaxy. So these videos are really an amazing document, and I was tempted to put some audio in this podcast, but there really is no substitute for seeing the videos themselves, so I will embed those on my blog. And there's about 2 hours of video. There's additional hours of Do himself giving his final testimony, and that's also fascinating to watch. But the videos of the cult members are really profoundly strange and unnerving when you see just how sanguine they are about their whole project, which is, on its face, really the most profligate misuse of human life imaginable. These are people who lived in total isolation for decades under the sway of obviously crazy ideas, depriving themselves of most of life's experience. And these are people who had abandoned children, they had abandoned the rest of their families, and abandoned every other human project that we might deem worthy of a person's attention and energy, and then killed themselves in the most carefree state of mind. And it was entirely the result of what they believed about the nature of the soul, about the nature of the kingdom of heaven, about the hideous condition of the world, and about the coming apocalypse that Do assured them was imminent, and that this represented their last chance to migrate to the kingdom of heaven. They didn't seize it now, everything would be lost. So these videos really are quite unique, and above all, they offer an insight into just what it's like to be totally convinced of paradise. The most shocking thing about this, well, there are a few things. One is the undeniable fact that most of these people were clearly happy in some basic sense. You struggle to detect in their faces and in their deliveries some clue to their deeper psychopathology. And in many cases, I think you will come up entirely empty. Now, these people bear all the signs of having spent, as most of them had, 20 plus years living in total isolation from the world. Most of these people had been part of this cult since the mid-70s, and this was in 1997 that they killed themselves. They all wore identical, terrible haircuts, and all had androgynous clothing that they buttoned up to the neck. I believe they shared all their clothing in common, including underwear. So they had a dogma of non-attachment that was operating here that led to a kind of self-effacement at the level of their presentation. They all wore equally terrible eyeglasses, those who needed them, like they all wandered into a lens crafter's and just asked for the worst pair of glasses that could possibly be pulled out of the box. So there's something about these people. They are misfits of a sort, and it's tempting to imagine that they were socially marginalized to a degree that somehow explains how they were recruited into the circumstance and therefore how they met their end. But that's not to say that these aren't happy, intelligent, relatively high-functioning people who could have succeeded in other contexts in life. And I think that's, to some degree, obviously true of some of them. One thing is clear, that many of these people were parents who entirely abandoned their children to join Do and T and submit their lives to this experiment, which, when you look at the details, is rather shocking to consider. It's shocking especially because when you listen to the teachings of Do, you can also watch hours of video where he describes all that he knows about the workings of the universe. some of this video, at least an hour of it, is his final testament given with the full knowledge that they're going to commit suicide in the coming days. And in watching Doe's performance here, I think you'll also look in vain for an obvious reason why people would give their lives over to this man. A few things are conspicuous. One is the total absence of compelling intellectual content. This is not a brilliant person. He's not bowling you over with his ability to connect ideas or to turn phrases. The only clue to his powers of mesmerism is his quality of eye contact, which, as I discussed at one point in my book, Waking Up, is a feature you find in gurus in general, and in people who are making heroic efforts to persuade. And in Doe, this is conspicuous. The man rarely blinks. He's looking at a camera lens for this video, but one can well imagine that this is the style of eye contact he used when talking to people directly. Maybe I'll offer a brief digression on this topic. There's actually a section in my book, Waking Up, where I talk about eye contact, and I'll just read it to you. A person's eyes convey a powerful illusion of inner life. The illusion is true, but it is an illusion all the same. When we look into the eyes of another human being, we seem to see the light of consciousness radiating from the eyes themselves. There's a glint of joy or judgment, perhaps. But every inflection of mood or personality, even the most basic indication that a person is alive, comes not from the eyes, but from the surrounding muscles of the face. If a person's eyes look clouded by madness or fatigue, the muscles orbicularis oculi are to blame. And if a person appears to radiate the wisdom of the ages, the effect comes not from the eyes, but from what he or she is doing with them. Nevertheless, the illusion is a powerful one, and there's no question that the subjective experience of inner radiance can be communicated with the gaze. It's not an accident, therefore, that gurus often show an unusual commitment to maintaining eye contact. In the best case, this behavior emerges from a genuine comfort in the presence of other people, and a deep interest in their well-being. Given such a frame of mind, there may simply be no reason to look away. But maintaining eye contact can also become a way of, quote, acting spiritual, and therefore an intrusive affectation. There are also people who maintain rigid eye lock not from an attitude of openness and interest, or from any attempt to appear open and interested, but as an aggressive and narcissistic show of dominance. Psychopaths tend to make exceptionally good eye contact. Whatever the motive behind it, there can be a tremendous power in an unwavering gaze. Most readers will know what I'm talking about, but if you want to witness a glorious example of the assertive grandiosity that a person's eyes can convey, watch a few interviews with Osho. I never met Osho, but I've met many people like him, and the way he plays the game of eye contact is simply hilarious. I confess that there was a period in my life, after I first plunged into matters spiritual, when I became a nuisance in this respect. Wherever I went, no matter how superficial the exchange, I gazed into the eyes of everyone I met as though they were my long-lost lover. No doubt many people found this more than a bit creepy. Others considered it a stark provocation. But it also precipitated exchanges with complete strangers that were fascinating. With some regularity, people of both sexes seemed to become bewitched by me on the basis of a single conversation. Had I been peddling some consoling philosophy, or been eager to gather students, I suspect that I could have made a proper mess of things. I definitely glimpsed the path that many spiritual impostors have taken throughout history. Interestingly, when one functions in this mode, one quickly recognizes all the other people who are playing the same game. I had many encounters wherein I would meet the eyes of a person across the room, and suddenly we were playing War of the Warlocks, two strangers holding each other's gaze well past the point that our primate genes or our cultural conditioning would ordinarily countenance. Play this game long enough and you begin to have some very strange encounters. I don't remember consciously deciding to stop behaving this way, but stop I did. In any case, I think Doe was probably a master of the unblinking gaze, and this may account for why he had the effect he did on people, because I can tell you, having read some of his writing, if you can call it that, and listened to him speak about his doctrine, there's nothing in the text of what he says that should have compelled people to follow him, much less follow him into their graves. And he persuaded people to follow him with surprising suddenness. There's an account of one of his early meetings, I think in the early 70s, where something like 20 people from a single lecture dropped their lives and disappeared from Portland or Seattle or wherever this talk happened, leaving their kids and their parents and their friends just aghast, and followed this man into the wilderness. So something was going on, and I don't know if it's the cologne he was wearing or the way he was boring holes into people's heads with his eyes, but the man had something that people found profoundly attractive. So I think I should just give a brief account of what Do was teaching people. He claimed to be an extraterrestrial who inhabited his body, the body of Marshall Applewhite, at some point in adulthood. And he also claimed to be the same reincarnate personality who had been Jesus and who had gathered apostles, many of whom were now in the Heaven's Gate class. So he had this project previously of trying to bring people to the kingdom of heaven, to the level above human, as the person of Jesus, but had failed because he had had the bad luck of getting crucified. So now he was back, delivering the wisdom of the ages. But now he could deliver it with a modern gloss. Now he could take into account the immensity of the universe and the existence of technology like spacecraft. And now the kingdom of heaven was a place elsewhere in the physical universe that could be reached by dying at this most opportune time. Originally he had suggested that spaceships would actually land on Earth and physically take people to this intergalactic space station where the level of above human was being lived out by aliens. But now, since the spaceships didn't land, and they had waited for years and years for the spaceships to land, but since they didn't, now the way to get to the spaceship, which was trailing the comet Hale-Bopp, was to die and leave the physical body. And all of these years of living in isolation was a preparation for the soul to take its place in this kingdom above human. And these were the teachings from the beginning. I don't think suicide was ever spoken of in the beginning because, again, they expected aliens to land and spirit them away on flying saucers. But death was often talked about as a possible way to get to the kingdom of heaven. In fact, cult members talk about hoping to provoke their own assassination in how they represented the teachings in front of fundamentalist Christians. They hoped that Christians would find their views so offensive that they would kill them and then engineer their escape to the next level. And Do and T talked often, they believed, based on, I believe, prophecy in the book of Revelation. They thought they were the two witnesses from Revelation. They thought they would be martyred and brought to the kingdom of heaven that way. So death was always kind of working in the background, and the idea was simply to live life in such a way as to divorce oneself from all human mammalian, as he put it, appetites, and prepare the soul to take a non-human form on a spaceship. What I think is so interesting about this phenomenon, and what can be seen so clearly by looking at these tapes, is the role that belief played in driving this behavior. This behavior is totally uninterpretable, but for the beliefs that these people espouse. And given these beliefs, it seems to make rather clear sense. Looking at these tapes is a corrective to the crazy denials we hear from so many journalists and pseudo-journalists and social scientists and politicians on the link between belief and action in a religious context. So many people talk about religious beliefs as though they simply do not lead to behavior, that they're somehow different from other sorts of beliefs. But of course, we must know this isn't true. And yet so many people pretend to know otherwise. Well, you can't pretend here. There's nothing apart from belief. No other variable explains this behavior. What they did was as straightforward as going to the candy store, given what they believed. So these exit interviews are a kind of microscope for the relevant psychology here. And when you map this on to the phenomenon of jihadism, in particular the phenomenon of suicide bombing that we see throughout the Muslim world, then the centrality of belief becomes obvious. And all of the obscurantism of people like Scott Atran and Karen Armstrong and Reza Aslan stands revealed for what it is, a denial of the obvious. So one can use cults as a kind of lens through which to view the phenomenon of the true believer. And of course, every religion is a kind of cult. It just has more subscribers. That's how we differentiate cults and religions. If you have millions of subscribers, you're a religion. If you have 1,000, or in this case, 40, you're a cult. Now, it's true that being in a tiny minority and having to set yourself in opposition to the rest of your culture and to the religion of your birth, that will tend to select for the truest of the true believers, the most credulous, the most committed people. So cult members have, almost by definition, something in common with what we call religious extremists in the context of a religion. The buy-in for a cult, to be the type of person who's going to drop everything for a religion focused on UFOs, as was the case with Heaven's Gate, that takes a certain kind of person. And when you look at these people, you see some of the aberration of all that. I mean, these are essentially like the most fanatical people at a Star Trek convention who also happen to believe in the rapture. The Venn diagram of cognitive commitments here is Trekkie and people who took the Left Behind novels seriously. But you also should remember that you're watching people who are about to die. These are people who are planning to commit suicide in the next few days. And they are telling you why. And they're telling you how this fits into their worldview. And it is fascinating to see, and it's quite tragic when you think of how these people use their lives, when you think of the children and parents and other family members they abandoned, and when you finally grok the fact that these were not all mentally ill people. These were people merely in the grip of specific ideas. What's interesting about the behavior of this group, in fact, is that up until the time they killed themselves, what they were doing was not that far from things that I've done, at least for months at a time, never years. But during my 20s, I spent about 2 years on silent meditation retreats in increments of up to 3 months, and these were without question some of the most productive and valuable months of my life. And the best meditation teachers I ever studied with were people who had truly spent decades in isolation, in some cases literally 20 years in a cave. So it's not isolation itself that is synonymous with the wastage of one's life. What one believes one is doing in isolation matters a lot. If you go into isolation for a year, just you hole yourself up in an apartment in some city with a dozen Barbie dolls, and you think that by the power of your concentration on these objects, you're going to turn them into real little girls. Okay, you're just a crazy pervert. This is not, isolation can obviously become a circumstance of unethical delusion. And in the case of Heaven's Gate, it was clearly a circumstance of delusion. All of their discipline was anchored to the project of attenuating their humanity so fully that they would be welcomed aboard a spaceship. And part of this project was consummated by at least the men, by going to Tijuana and having themselves castrated. 8 of the men in this group, including Doe, the leader, had themselves castrated so that they could best resist the siren song of their own endocrine system and forget about sexuality entirely. And because of what they believed about the soul and where they were going after the death of their bodies, they felt truly lucky to be who they were. They were leaving a sinking ship and felt true compassion for all of the confused people like ourselves who didn't have the good sense to get off it. But the horror, of course, is that they were wrong, right? Their beliefs were almost certainly false in every respect. And this is the horror of religion generally. This is the horror of Islamism and jihadism. And again, what is central to the phenomenon, the thing that makes it so horrible and yet so captivating to true believers, is this promise of paradise, is the idea that most of what is good in any individual's existence is the part that comes after death. That is really the claim that just leaches all the value out of this world. For instance, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the surviving Boston Marathon bomber, wrote on the side of the boat where he was finally captured, "Know you are fighting men who look into the barrel of your gun and see heaven. How can you compete with that?" That's what we're dealing with, this expectation of paradise. I recently read an interview with a former ISIS fighter, and he spoke about this same thing, about being motivated by his concern for the afterlife, which he called, quote, the surest part of life. The surest part of life. This is the thing you can most count on. This is the repository of most value. But of course, it's not the surest part of life. It's at best an hypothesis, founded on nothing. But this is exactly the sentiment you get from the Heaven's Gate members. They're talking about how happy they will be when they finally get to the level above human, the kingdom of heaven. Look at what is going on in the Middle East. Look at the behavior of a group like ISIS. Look at the Western recruits who by the thousands are coming to fight alongside these guys. And recognize that whatever diversity of their backgrounds, whatever other variables we are told account for this behavior, simply realize that these people also believe what they say they believe. And that belief, in their case too, is the primary driver of behavior. And that these people who now, in the case of ISIS, are murdering apostates and seeking to murder vast numbers of their enemies, these people are just as eager to die and just as unconflicted about the apparent misuse of their lives in this world, just as expectant of eternity as the class members of Heaven's Gate were. And when you have that epiphany, you'll be in a position to see how confused most people are by current events. So much of what passes for an analysis of Islamism and jihadism at this moment skates across this psychological fact or denies it outright, looking for other reasons for this phenomenon. And whatever contributions these other reasons might make, whatever contributions U.S. foreign policy or a legacy of colonialism or the lack of integration of Muslims in Western Europe might play, the basic fact, the fact at the core of the phenomenon, held and held deeply, is the belief in paradise. The belief that death is an illusion and that this world, therefore, can be forsaken. In fact, its purpose is to be forsaken. And unless one has some countervailing philosophy that demands a truly ethical engagement with this world, it seems that a belief in paradise makes a person capable of anything. Nothing can go wrong. You can blow up crowds of children and you're doing them a favor. That's what makes this type of religious certainty so terrifying. And the impulse to deny its power, to deny that it is even operating, is more terrifying still. In lying to ourselves about the motivations of these people, we are sleepwalking toward a precipice. Perhaps it's time we all woke up. If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can discuss it on your own blog or podcast. Or you can help fund it directly. And there are two ways you can do this. You can try membership at Audible, the world's leading source of audiobooks, at audibletrial.com/Sam Harris. Or you can make a donation through my website at samharris.org/donate. many of you know, there was recently a triple murder in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, committed by a person named Craig Stephen Hicks, who is still alive. This was not a suicide murder. So undoubtedly we'll one day hear what his conscious motives were, but he killed 3 young people, apparently over a parking space. At least that was the subject of their dispute. But he happens to have been a person who identified as an atheist on his Facebook page and expressed admiration for people like Richard Dawkins. He might have said something about me, I'm actually not sure. But he was self-identified as an atheist and critical of all religion, apparently, on his Facebook page. And because the victims of this crime were Muslim, it is now being widely described as a hate crime. And it, in fact, is being described as a symptom of a problem that we have in the atheist community, a problem of militancy, a problem of anti-Muslim bigotry. And many people are claiming that I am somehow responsible for this, both for the background problem and for the murders themselves, which is quite an amazing thing to be accused of. So it seems to me there's a fair amount of moral confusion here, and also just factual confusion about the reality of human violence in the US and elsewhere. But the first thing to say is that I feel nothing but horror over this crime. These people were killed in the very prime of their life, at the beginning of their adult lives. And they were, by all accounts, marvelous people. I can only imagine, in fact, I can't imagine, the grief of their parents and their loved ones. So there's absolutely nothing in my work or in my mind that is supportive of a crime like this. And I would have hoped that could go without saying, and I think in this context it probably can't. Nevertheless, the deluge of claims of equivalence between this crime and the Charlie Hebdo atrocity, or the daily behavior of a group like ISIS, has been astonishing to witness. And you can sense that people have just been waiting for a crime like this that could conceivably be pinned on atheism. But of course, the analogy between militant atheism and militant Islam is a terrible one. It is an anti-analogy. It is false in every respect. Atheists are simply not out there harming people on the basis of their atheism. Now, there may be atheists who do terrible things, but there's no atheist doctrine or scripture. And insofar as any of us have written books or created arguments that have persuaded people, these books and arguments, insofar as they're atheistic, only relate to the bad evidence put forward in defense of a belief in God. There's no argument in atheism that suggests that you should hate or victimize or stigmatize whole groups of people, as there often is in revealed religion. And what we're seeing is that people like Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan and the usual suspects, the bevy of apologists for theocracy in the Muslim world, are using this very real tragedy in Chapel Hill to try to stoke a kind of mob mentality around an imagined atheist campaign of bigotry against Muslims. It's an incredibly cynical and tendentious and opportunistic and ultimately dangerous thing to do. Of course, people like Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan are alleging that there's some kind of double standard here, that atheists are so quick to detect a religious motivation in the misbehavior of Muslims worldwide, but when it comes to their own, well, then they discount the role played by atheism. But this is just a total misrepresentation of how an atheist like myself thinks about human violence. It is simply obvious that some instances of Muslim violence have nothing whatsoever to do with Islam. And I would never dream of assigning blame to the religion of Islam for that behavior. And to my knowledge, I never have. And insofar as I'm ever confused about the source of Muslim violence, well then I apologize in advance for that confusion. But the problem, of course, is that there are teachings within Islam that explicitly recommend, in fact demand, violence in certain circumstances. Circumstances which we in the 21st century if we are decent human beings, will recognize as being morally insane. Apostasy, blasphemy, adultery, merely holding hands with a man who is not your blood relative or husband, if you are a woman unlucky enough to be born in a country like Afghanistan. These are rather often killing offenses. And the link between the doctrine, as it is understood by Islamists and jihadists at this point, and the behavior is explicit, it's logical, it is absolutely unambiguous. And yet this doesn't prevent people from denying it at every turn. Now there is no such link between atheism or secularism and violence of any kind, in any circumstance. There's nothing about rejecting the truth claims of religious dogmatists. There's nothing about doubting that the universe has a creator that suggests that violence in certain circumstances is necessary or even acceptable. And all the people who are comparing these murders to Charlie Hebdo or to ISIS, as insane as that sounds, are really trivializing a kind of violence that threatens to destabilize much of the world. And ironically, it is violence whose principal victims are Muslims. I would also point out that the idea that there's some kind of epidemic of hate crime against Muslims in the United States is totally at odds with the facts. You need only check the FBI website, and you'll see that there is no such wave of religious bigotry directed against Muslims or directed against anyone at all, in fact. Hate crime is a very rare offense. 5 people were murdered on the basis of hate crime in 2013. And when you look at the hate crimes directed at people based on religious bigotry, the crimes against Jews based on anti-Semitism outnumber the crimes against Muslims 5 to 1. And this is every year, and this is even in 2002, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So if we're going to be concerned about hate crime in the U.S., we should be concerned about anti-Semitism before we worry about anti-Muslim hate crime. And the level of anti-Semitism in the U.S. is minuscule when you're talking about violence against persons. Now, I wouldn't say the same thing of France, but in the U.S., it is virtually a non-problem. Especially when you compare it to the tens of thousands of ordinary murders and rapes and aggravated assaults that happen on the basis of purely interpersonal violence. People are saying that this could not possibly have been a triple murder born of a neighbor's dispute over a parking space. But this is the most common form of interpersonal violence. It never makes sense on paper. You're talking about people who fail to regulate their emotional states, and they have, in the U.S., ready access to weaponry that makes it incredibly easy to kill someone impulsively. So hate crime per se is not a major problem, and the people who are trying to whip up a frenzy of concern over the ambient level of bigotry and intolerance and violence against Muslims in the U.S. are really trying to engineer a kind of moral panic designed to distract people from the real problems that Muslims face, and that we all face, frankly, which is this basic incompatibility between a 7th century theocracy and our collective aspiration to build a truly pluralistic and global civil society. You can understand this all through the lens of free speech, right? This is all you need to consider. A phenomenon like Charlie Hebdo, or the satanic verses. And for some reason, people on the left have aligned themselves with theocrats and people who are truly intolerant of the very liberal values that apologists for Islam think they're enunciating. As I've said before, tolerance of intolerance is just cowardice. And it's a cowardice that's increasingly consequential. So this analogy between so-called militant atheism and militant Islam is essentially a moral hoax. The thing that very few people seem able to distinguish, and the distinction that Greenwald and Aslan obfuscate at every opportunity, is the difference between criticizing ideas and their results in the world, and hating people as people because they belong to a certain group, or because they have a certain skin color, or because they came from a certain country. there is no connection between those two orientations. But the latter is, of course, bigotry, and I would condemn it as harshly as anyone would hope. But criticizing ideas and their consequences is absolutely essential, and that is the spirit in which I have criticized Islam in various flavors, and Christianity, and Judaism, and Buddhism, and all of these criticisms are different because these belief systems are different. So that's the distinction that one has to recognize, and the clarity of that distinction leads to a kind of experience in the world that our critics seem to not imagine is possible. So for instance, after I had that collision with Ben Affleck on Bill Maher's show Real Time, where I uttered this now infamous line, Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas. As I've said before, I think I slightly misspoke there. I should have said it is a motherlode of bad ideas. It's not the only motherlode of bad ideas, but it's the one that frankly concerns me most at this moment in history. Afterwards, I was in a restaurant, and a maitre d' in that restaurant came up and introduced himself and said he recognized me from the show, and he was Muslim, and the resulting conversation was nothing but a positive encounter between two people who had very different views of Islam. It was no surprise to me, and there was no difficulty in acknowledging that my blanket condemnation of Islam didn't capture his feeling as a devout and peaceful Muslim about the significance of his faith. I understand that, and he understood where I was coming from. He understood I wasn't talking about him when I'm talking about the problem with ideas like jihad and martyrdom and apostasy. We had this conversation in a spirit of absolute mutual respect and tolerance. There was not a scintilla of bigotry in my mind, and this guy was the nicest guy in the world, right? So I've been back to the restaurant since, hugged him. There's absolutely nothing hostile about my orientation toward individual people who happen to be Muslim. Now, given the requisite beliefs on their part, the hostility will be inevitable. If I'm in the presence of a Muslim who thinks that infidels are the scum of the earth, we're not going to be hugging each other. But the idea is that somehow my criticism of concepts leads me to hate people is just, there's no point of contact between that and my actual psychology. And I'm sure this is true of Richard Dawkins, and it was true of Hitch, and it's true of Lawrence Krauss, and every other prominent atheist who unfortunately has to waste a fair amount of his or her life criticizing the terrible ideas of religion. Not to put too fine a point on this, but the psychological reality of being a so-called militant atheist seems to be so difficult for our critics to imagine that I feel like I need to give another example. So I'm writing this book with Maajid Nawaz, who I've mentioned before on this podcast. No doubt many of you are aware of who he is, but he's a former Islamist, now a Muslim reformer, brilliant, interesting, indispensable, who I now consider a friend. He wasn't a friend before this collaboration because we didn't know each other, but now I consider him a friend and actually a personal hero. He's an immensely courageous man. So he and I are collaborating on this book, the title of which is Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And as you'll see in this book, much of it has the character of a debate where I am pushing somewhat hard on specific ideas within Islam, and he is telling me how these ideas are susceptible to more benign interpretation so as to move Islam forward into the 21st century. But the crucial point is I don't have to censor myself on the topic of Islam to have this conversation. Maajid knows exactly what I think about Islam and concepts like jihad and martyrdom and apostasy. He knows exactly what I think about the treatment of women throughout the Muslim world. There is no contradiction between having a civil but nonetheless hard-hitting and searching conversation about a very important, even inflammatory topic, and having a positive ethical orientation toward the person you're arguing with. I actually said something to this effect in a recent Washington Post article, and Glenn Greenwald linked to this on Twitter, saying that Sam Harris wants us to know that he has a Muslim friend. So he's accusing me of using the some of my best friends are black defense. And he also branded Majid as a critic of Islam, dismissing him as a mere critic of Islam, and therefore, of course, he's the kind of Muslim I would associate with. So he treats Majid like an Uncle Tom. And please remember, this is coming from a gay Jew living safely outside the Muslim world who would be hurled from a rooftop any place within it. Now, perhaps the most charitable interpretation I can give to this behavior is that people like Greenwald and Aslan think that my criticism of Islam and the criticism of the new atheists generally is so easily misunderstood by mentally unbalanced or racist or xenophobic people that it's dangerous. It's dangerous to focus on Islam because bad people will misinterpret the significance of this focus and commit murders of the sort we just witnessed in North Carolina. Now, let me concede, it's certainly possible that the murders in North Carolina were a hate crime. It could be that when Hicks starts talking, he'll tell us how much he hates Muslims and he just wanted to kill a few. And he might even say he read The God Delusion and The End of Faith and God is Not Great and took from these books some kind of rationale to victimize Muslims at random. I think it is incredibly unlikely that that's the case. I will be flabbergasted if Hicks says that his atheism drove him to commit these murders, whereas the next jihadist will almost certainly say that his religion mandated that he behave the way he did. But perhaps people like Greenwald and Aslan think that criticizing Islam is just dangerous because it could be misunderstood by bad people. Well, by that standard, we can't criticize anything. This, as Ali Rizvi pointed out, this would be like saying we can't criticize U.S. foreign policy because some number of people overseas will become so agitated by this criticism, by reading Noam Chomsky or Glenn Greenwald, that they will then kill U.S. tourists at random. Is that possible? Sure, it's possible. But we have to be able to criticize U.S. foreign policy. And some of what people like Chomsky and Greenwald write about U.S. foreign policy is correct. Should they be held responsible if some deranged person takes their writing and uses it as a basis for intolerance or even murder? No, of course not. And the same can be said for any criticism of the doctrine of Islam. I want to make one thing very clear. In saying or writing or otherwise publishing the opinion that I have blood on my hands, and then backing that up with conscious misrepresentations of my views about Islam, that is a dangerous thing to do. It's dangerous for me. It's not dangerous for Greenwald and Aslan, and they know it. But it is dangerous for me. It increases the risk to me and my family from religious lunatics in the Muslim community. Now, both Aslan and Greenwald know that some number of people among their readers are proper lunatics, the goons and madmen who are organized entirely around this variable of Islam and its importance to their lives and to the future of humanity. And if you tell them, as Greenwald and Aslan repeatedly have, whether in their own words or by circulating the lies of others, that I want to nuke the Muslim world, or that I want to round Muslims up for torture, or that I'm a genocidal fascist maniac, or that I want to profile dark-skinned people at airports, or that I want to kill people for thought crimes, or that I have blood on my hands for the murders of 3 beautiful young people in North Carolina. This is dangerous, and I've asked them to stop it, and I'm asking them to stop it again. I'm about to release a book on Islam with Majid Nawaz. Majid has serious security concerns. He is my co-author, telling millions of people that I have incited hatred against Muslims that led to the deaths of these poor people in North Carolina is totally unethical. Aslan and Greenwald are mendacious bullies. They're making it unsafe to criticize bad ideas that absolutely have to be criticized. There is no view that I have ever published that I am hiding from. I've written about torture and profiling, but none of my views reduce to anything that could be the basis of hatred of whole groups of people. And it's very difficult just may in fact be impossible to counter these lies once they are in circulation. Just as I was making this podcast in the last few hours, there was an incident in Denmark where a meeting about these issues, about free speech and blasphemy and the drawing of cartoons, was attacked by a terrorist. And one person died and several people were injured, and then this terrorist went on to kill someone at a synagogue. In fact, you can hear the audio on the BBC website. Actually, I'll play it for you. This is what it's like for peaceful people to gather in a cafe and attempt to have a conversation on these issues in an open society.
I realized that every time we talk about activity of those people, there will be always, yes, it is freedom of speech, but. And the turning point is but. Why do we still say but when we...
You have to ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of world do you want your kids to live in? This is the world you're living in now. And as someone who is spending a fair amount of time dealing with these issues, I can tell you that I no longer feel safe doing so. And apart from jihadists themselves, there is no one I know of who's making this job less safe than people like Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan. And not just for me, obviously, but I'm talking about those people in Copenhagen. I'm talking about people in open societies everywhere who have to deal with this growing menace of jihadism. Unless we can speak honestly about this, unless we can resist the theocratic demands being placed on us, we will lose our way of life. In fact, we have already lost it in many respects. We have to reclaim our freedom of speech. So if you care about living in an open society that doesn't more and more resemble Jerusalem or Beirut, if you care about free speech, real freedom of speech, not merely its political guarantee, but the reality of being able to speak about what you need to speak about in public without being murdered by some maniac, or without having to spend the rest of your life being hunted by a religious mob. If you care about my work or the work of other secularists and atheists, or that of Muslim reformers like Maajid Nawaz, or apostates like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, if you care about our ability to notice and criticize and correct for bad ideas, then you have to condemn this behavior. You have to condemn the deliberate manufacture of lies designed to make it unsafe to have honest conversations. So please push back against this. Please lose your patience for shocking displays of intellectual dishonesty on the part of people like Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan, and all the other commentators who obfuscate the plain reality of religious fanaticism. Your response to this really matters. The things you do on your own blogs and on social media and in comment threads really make a difference. Thanks for your help. Well, this is an Ask Me Anything podcast. I've now received hundreds of questions on Twitter and in other formats, and I'll try to get through several of them, but many have converged on a single topic, which will come as no surprise: the recent atrocities in Paris, the murders of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonist, and the murders in the Jewish market. And also many of you are concerned about the subsequent self-censorship, which has really been quite amazing to witness. It's just astonishing that the media cannot do the one thing that it could do to keep it and everyone else safe. And it can't do the one thing that would have kept the Charlie Hebdo cartoonist safe, which is publish en masse all of these cartoons and present a united front against this creeping theocracy. So I'll try to say a few things on this topic. I haven't commented on it publicly yet, and while I've been circulating the interviews done by friends and colleagues like Majid Nawaz and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Douglas Murray, all of them have been excellent. I've been declining interviews myself, and I'm not quite sure why I've been doing that. I think the main reason is that it's just become toxic for me to say over and over again that which should really go without saying and to then be vilified for it. So it really is no fun dealing with this topic. Although I am writing a short book with Majid Nawaz, the working title of which is Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And I'm very happy about that. Majid is doing amazing work, and he's really just indispensable. And we're having a very good conversation. And that will be published in June, at the latest, I hope, by Harvard University Press. And beyond everything we may or may not agree about, I think we've produced an example of a fundamentally different conversation on this problem of Islam at this moment. And if you don't know who Majid is, you should Google him. He's a former Islamist who obviously knows exactly why Islamists do what they do. But now he's a reformer, and he's quite articulate on the topic of how to move Islam forward. And while I'm skeptical of that project and increasingly worried that it might be hopeless, he and I managed to have a very good conversation. So I will alert you all to the birth of that book when it occurs. But perhaps I can say a few things about recent events in the meantime. Well, the first thing to say is that the response of liberals, and again, it is so depressing to have to use the term liberal in a pejorative way in this context, but liberalism has completely lost its moorings on the topic of Islam. Needless to say, we have all the usual suspects, Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan and Chris Hedges and Karen Armstrong, and as unreadable as these people have become, you can't help but notice the stupid things they say about Islam, even in the immediate aftermath of an atrocity like this. And as will come as no surprise, they will tell you that this has nothing to do with Islam. It has nothing to do with heartfelt religious convictions. No, it has everything to do with capitalism and the oppression of minorities and the racism of white people in Europe and the racism of cartoonists at a magazine like Charlie Hebdo. That is the cause of this behavior. That's what causes someone to grab an AK-47 and murder 12 cartoonists and then scream Allahu Akbar in the streets. It is a completely insane analysis. Even if you grant everything that's wrong with capitalism and the history of colonialism, you should not be able to deny that these religious maniacs are motivated by concerns about blasphemy and the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, and consider their behavior entirely ethical in light of specific religious doctrines. And it's a kind of masochism and moral cowardice and lack of intelligence, frankly, at this point, that is allowing people to deny this fact. And then we have the practice of self-censorship, which is completely understandable and entirely based on fear. And the reason why it's understandable is that this fear is actually quite rational if you were the only person or news organization printing pictures of the Prophet Muhammad. And that's why every newspaper and magazine and news outlet on Earth should have agreed to print the latest Charlie Hebdo cover immediately on the same day and spread the risk. We hear everywhere about this false trade-off between freedom of speech and freedom of religion, as though there was some kind of balance to be struck here. There is no balance to be struck. Freedom of speech never infringes on freedom of religion. There's nothing I could say in this podcast about religion generally or about Islam in particular that would infringe upon someone else's freedom to practice his or her religion. If your freedom of religion entails that you force those who do not share it to conform to it, well, then that's not freedom of religion. We have a word for that. That's theocracy. This respect that we are all urged to show for, quote, religious sensitivity is actually a demand that the blasphemy laws of Islam be followed by non-Muslims. And secular liberals in the West are defending this thuggish ultimatum and putting the lives of cartoonists and journalists and freethinkers and public intellectuals in jeopardy day after day. So we're harming ourselves when we practice censorship on this point. The Muslim world simply has to get used to free speech winning. And we should make no apologies for this. But there are several double standards that are quite harmful on this point. For instance, it is illegal in France and Germany and a few other countries in Western Europe to deny the Holocaust. That's a bad law. A person should be absolutely free to deny the Holocaust. which is to say he should be free to destroy his reputation, and others should be free to ridicule him and to boycott his business. There shouldn't be a law against this kind of idiocy. And making this category of speech illegal is a terrible mistake. And Islamists and liberals are using this mistake as a basis to condemn the so-called hypocrisy of all the people who are defending Charlie Hebdo at this moment. Whatever you think about the content of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, and as many people have pointed out, this content has been misunderstood outside of France. Cartoons that appear racist to a non-French speaker, to someone who's ignorant of French politics, are anything but racist when you understand the context. But even if you granted that most of these cartoons were racist and therefore offensive, you have to concede that protecting this speech becomes important when you have one group of people, quote, radical Muslims, who are responding to this offense with credible threats of murder in every country on earth. We can't give in to this. So here's one sign that a person, whether he's on the left or the right politically, has completely lost the plot here. The moment he begins to ask, what was in those cartoons? Were those cartoons racist? Was that a negative portrayal of Muhammad? To ask such questions is obscene. People have been murdered over cartoons. End of moral analysis. And we are seeing a total capitulation on the part of news organizations in the face of this terror. The fact that the New York Times will not print the current cover of Charlie Hebdo, even though it is absolutely newsworthy, and even though they are writing articles about it, is shocking. And we should notice how euphemism is preventing honest conversation on this topic. We use words like extremists and extremism. What do these words mean? Well, extremism generally suggests that an expression of a certain set of ideas has become an exaggeration or distortion of those ideas. But when we're talking about Muslim extremists, have they really exaggerated or distorted the core teachings of Islam? No, Muslim extremists are motivated by the most literal and straightforward and comprehensive resort to the ideas expressed in the Quran and the Hadith. What is ISIS doing that Muhammad didn't do or didn't advocate somewhere in Scripture? Good luck finding something important. And that's a fact that we just have to absorb. That is a body blow to political correctness that just has to land and land hard. Happily, someone like Majid Nawaz is prepared to talk about this. He's prepared to take the other side in a conversation, with me in this case, and he can do it without lying about the connection between what people believe and their behavior in the world. And he should be distinguished in your mind from someone like Reza Aslan, who is a fount of lies and misdirection on this topic. Reza is one of these people who has said in recent days that the murder of cartoonists and Jews in Paris was due to the failure of integration of Muslims in France and the racism that has been directed at them. This is leveraging a very common intuition. There must be two sides to every conflict, right? So there's two sides to this story. On the one hand, you have the racism of Charlie Hebdo and its readers, and on the other side, you have the poor immigrants who are struggling to assimilate in a hostile society. That's what causes people to slaughter cartoonists while shouting, "We have avenged the Prophet." This politically correct analysis is morally insane. And news organizations and readership lose their patience for it. To focus on the content of the cartoons, as people like Aslan and Greenwald have done, as though it were somehow morally relevant, is a disgrace. And the moment that someone does it, he has tipped his hand. It is a perfect litmus test. I get the sense that people still don't understand what we're dealing with here. Have you seen any of these recent interviews with captured ISIS fighters? Religion is the whole story. They are totally fixated on getting into paradise. In fact, the Kurds have put female soldiers into the field, and this terrifies members of ISIS because they believe that they won't go to paradise if they get killed by a woman. They literally run away from these female soldiers. It's like a culture of psychotic and psychopathic children. And just consider the attitude they show toward real children. Of course, they've been murdering Shia and Christian and Yazidi children, burying them alive and crucifying them. But they seem happy to inflict needless horror on their own children. I mean, you may have read a story recently about a street magician in Raqqa, Syria, who had been entertaining children for years. ISIS deemed his activities un-Islamic and cut his head off. Just imagine what it is like to be a child in this context. Imagine the sort of men and women that such a childhood will produce. The crucial thing to understand is that stories like that do not represent an excessive use of force by a few deranged individuals. All of this butchery, the murder of journalists and aid workers, the torture of women who get caught breastfeeding in public, is as central to the project of jihadism as an opening of a new Starbucks is for us. This is what they think is best about themselves. This is what they use to advertise their project to the rest of the world. Video footage of an aid worker getting his head cut off, is part of their recruiting materials. These horrible stories coming out of Syria and Iraq, this is not their My Lai massacre. This is what they unabashedly stand for. This is an expression of a worldview, and this worldview is contagious. It doesn't matter if a person's had direct contact with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or whether he's, quote, a lone wolf. But we're talking about the spread of ideas. Again, ideas about martyrdom and jihad and paradise and the rights of women and blasphemy. The point we cannot ignore, the point that should never be obfuscated, is that we are at war with a global phenomenon of jihadism. And there can be no compromise with this death cult. And these fake liberals, these fellow travelers with theocracy, these people who in the name of liberalism protect only political correctness and masochism, they are absolutely part of the problem. They are preventing us from demanding that the Muslim community worldwide get its act together. And this is why expressions of horror and rejection are insufficient in the Muslim community. Of course you're horrified by this behavior if you're a decent human being and have even a tenuous connection to civil society in the 21st century. But that's not enough. Muslims have to honestly grapple with the bad doctrines in their faith. They can no longer just say that Islam is a religion of peace. They can no longer lie about the doctrines that relate to martyrdom, jihad, and apostasy and the rights of women. Muslims have to fight a civil war of ideas, or a civil war against jihadism, and Islamism generally. That's what has to happen. It's not a matter of blaming all Muslims for the actions of a few. It's a matter of demanding a reformation within Islam that only Muslims can accomplish. The civilized world is waiting for this to happen, and people will continue to die until it does. And of course, most of the people dying are Muslims. As I said, the conversation I'm having with Majeed Nawaz is directly on this point. And Majeed is doing extremely important work with the Quilliam Foundation, and I encourage you all to look him up if you're not aware of who he is. Well, moving on to a very different topic, about which I've also received several questions. I released a video of a lecture I gave in the fall on the subject of my book, Waking Up, and that's available on my website. But I received complaints from several readers that I was selling it and not offering it for free. Now, I knew this was coming, and this is actually a difficult thing for me to talk about, but I think it's important. We've all begun to expect everything online for free, and I include myself in this. I want to read articles and watch videos, and I don't want to pay anything for them. If someone sends me a link to an article in the Wall Street Journal, and I hit their paywall, I'm not going to read it. I don't want to subscribe to another newspaper or magazine, certainly not for a single article, and money aside, it's just too much of a hassle. But of course, everything can't be free online, or no one will be able to make a living producing quality work. We have yet to find an elegant solution to this problem. But the problem runs deeper than this because people actually make a significant effort to find content for free rather than buy it. I've heard from several people, ostensibly fans, who are just waiting to find my Waking Up video for free on a file sharing site, that is, illegally pirated. These are people who will express a totally positive orientation toward my work, but they just don't want to spend $4.99 on a video. And in fact, I've heard from people who bought the video and really enjoyed it, but regretted that they had purchased it before they realized that it was available on a file sharing site for free. And of course, it's only available on a file sharing site because somebody, some fan of mine, I suspect, I actually don't think this was malicious, but some fan bought the video and then uploaded it because he felt that he is a better judge of whether it should be offered for free than I am. So this is an interesting problem because I completely understand the expectation that information should be free. Again, I feel it myself online. Paywalls suck. We need to find a more elegant solution than repeatedly asking people to input their credit card information. But we are all experiencing a race to the bottom now, where it's becoming harder and harder to charge for content online, and therefore harder to have a career as a writer or musician or photographer or filmmaker or journalist. Jaron Lanier wrote a very interesting book entitled Who Owns the Future that focuses squarely on this topic. Now, content creators are all in competition with one another, of course, for our time and money. But they're also in competition with free versions of themselves. For instance, I wrote a book, Line, a very short book. And it was initially published, I think, for $2.99 as an ebook. And I received complaints from people who noticed that they could read 8,000 or 10,000 word articles on my blog for free. And they were now wondering why they should be expected to pay anything, even just $2.99, for an essay of similar length as an ebook. So it's interesting to see what's happening here. I'm losing a competition with a free version of myself. I was being penalized for having written blog articles that were so long and fulfilling, apparently, that they seemed to undermine any justification for charging for something of similar length in the future. And this is a weird situation to be in. For instance, I just spoke about a book that Majid Nawaz and I are writing. Now, it's of similar length and format to some of the longest conversations I've had on my blog. And the question will be asked, why not just release this on your blog for free? Well, there are several reasons, but the main one is that it takes a lot of time to do this well. And I asked a lot of Majid's time to get this book written. And it is just unsustainable to spend this kind of time again and again and again and again for free. And most of the writing I do is for free, and most of the speaking I've done has been for free. But it has to be subsidized by work that is financially viable. If you like reading my blog articles, or you like listening to podcasts or seeing videos of me online for free, the only way to support this work is to buy the thing I'm selling when I'm selling it. And in the case of this Waking Up video, I was actually trying to do something unusual. I produced a video that is obviously of higher quality than anything that's likely to happen on its own when I get invited to give a lecture and then someone records it and puts it online. And it turns out that it's very expensive to do this. It's expensive to merely acquire the footage. I recorded 3 separate talks in 3 separate cities, and this was all done professionally with a 5-camera crew in each city. There really should be no mystery about why I would need to charge for a video like this. It costs over $100,000 to make. So the question of whether it makes sense for me to produce a video of high quality is a question that can only be answered affirmatively by your willingness to pay for it. So I am running an experiment here, and the only way to support it, I'm afraid, is to buy the video and not download the pirated version. Now, my concern is that this is all sounding more mercenary than it is. I mean, it is an immense privilege to do the work that I do. I actually get paid, sometimes, to do work that I would do anyway for free. I'm not working in a coal mine. But the general picture here, that you should all be aware of, is that it is increasingly difficult to figure out how to get paid for doing work of this kind. I'm in a privileged position to absorb this difficulty, and many other writers and podcasters aren't. So if there's a podcast you love and you've been listening to it for free for months, and there's some way to support it, they have an Amazon affiliates link on their website or they have a donate button, I would encourage you to support it, because we're all trying to find some way to cross over into this digital future of media. And free really is the enemy. Free has made it almost impossible for musicians to get paid for their music. Now they're just forced to tour endlessly in order to make up the difference. The problem for writers in particular is that touring is generally not an option. Many writers are not people who can make money speaking. I mean, they were writers after all. Unless we can figure out how to subsidize the creation of quality content with something more than banner ads, the entire world is going to become the Huffington Post. Now, unfortunately, I don't know what the solution is, but personally, for the moment at least, I intend to occasionally charge for something that took a lot of work to create, and then do the rest of what I do for free. And so, for instance, before I got on this topic, I spent about 15 minutes or so talking about the problem of global jihad. Okay, why did I do that? Well, because I think it's a very important problem, obviously. But I wasn't getting paid to do that. And I'm incurring a non-trivial security risk for doing it. So think of this in light of my forthcoming book with Majid Nawaz, which also could be offered for free on my blog, but I actually feel that given the amount of time we're putting into it, and given the obvious benefit of having Harvard University Press help us launch it, it makes sense to publish it as a book. And so if you are behind the project of speaking honestly about the problem of Islamism and global jihad, and you think I'm contributing something useful to that conversation, or Majid is, then when we publish this book, the only way to cast your vote, not just about the book, but about podcasts like this, is to buy it and read it and talk about it, and not wait for some pirated version of it to be scanned and put online so that you can read it for free. All right, so now that I have browbeaten you all sufficiently, we can move on to other topics. So I have several other questions here, and I will be briefer. Do you think social progress can ever go backward? For example, a return to slavery or public executions? Yes, I do. I don't think there's anything about moral progress that is guaranteed. We conquer ground, and we can lose that ground, and the bad people can certainly win. So all the more reason to fight evil and lunacy wherever we encounter it. How careful, if at all, should liberal critics of Islam be that their criticisms don't give cover for illiberal racists? Well, I really, again, I think this is a non-issue. I think that if what you're saying relates to ideas and their consequences, and you're actually not promulgating racism, which is to say you're not concerned about the color of people's skin or their ethnicity, you're just talking about ideas, well then people are going to use your clear thinking for some nefarious purpose. That is outside of your control. That there obviously are racists who are going to continue to be racists. And on any specific point, their animus toward brown-skinned people or Arabs or immigrants may align with a totally rational concern about specific ideas or social policies. But that's not something you can correct for by not criticizing bad ideas or specific policies. So I really think it is a non-issue. I think we should disparage racism wherever we encounter it, and we should talk candidly about specific ideas, in this case within Islam, like a belief in martyrdom or jihad. So I don't see any contradiction there between being committed to clear thinking about dangerous ideas and being committed to treating people as people fairly across the board. How can we convince apologists that religious people really do believe what they say they believe and that their God is not metaphorical? Well, this is actually a very difficult problem. I think that many apologists know that they're lying. So there are dishonest apologists. There are people who know that religious fanatics are motivated by their fanaticism, and that it's not politics, and that it's not economics, and that there's a straight line between belief and behavior. And I'm convinced that many apologists know this, and they're lying about it for reasons that are generally inscrutable. But there are people who are simply confused. They don't know what it's like to believe in God, and for that reason they doubt that anyone really does. And this is a difficult problem to get around. I mean, there seems to be no manifestation of religious fanaticism that is so unequivocal as to convince people that it really must have been born of religious ideology rather than some other motive. Now, curiously, they don't tend to feel this about other kinds of religious behavior. So the people who go to church on Sundays and they eat the communion host at the Mass and they say the Rosary, and when you ask people why Catholics, in this case, would behave this way, well, they will admit that it's on the basis of their Catholic beliefs. But when you talk about behavior that causes immense harm in the world, then they ascribe this behavior to some other motive. Even in the case of a suicide bomber who's left a video testimony as to his expectation of getting into paradise. So there is no evidence that would be sufficient for many of these people, and they have, for whatever reason, rigged the game this way. They've either rigged their own minds or they've rigged the public conversation, and there's nothing to do but keep talking past them in a hope of reaching other people. During mindfulness, how do you know when you're experiencing consciousness without the ego? Well, it's a little bit like asking, how do you know when you're no longer lost in thought? It's something you can be wrong about. Just as you can be thinking without knowing that you're thinking, you can be thinking about the illusoriness of the self and not be aware that that's all you're doing, just thinking. So you can have an undercurrent of thought present that is uninspected. So you can have a clear moment of seeing the selflessness of consciousness, and then get lost in thought again in the next moment and not see that that's occurred. And the character of that thought could just be seeming to extend this intuition about the selflessness of consciousness. So you could just be thinking about how there is no self and about how consciousness is vast and open and spacious, etc. So it is possible to be confused on this topic, but there is an experience of clarity that you can keep repeating. Again, it doesn't have a very long half-life for most people, just a second or two, but its duration can extend the more you practice. And it's a clear dropping out of any sense of there being a center to the field of consciousness. Again, in the midst of what could otherwise be a totally ordinary experience of conscious awareness. So it's like anything else. It can be repeated again and again and inspected again and again until you achieve some kind of clarity and confidence that this is in fact what consciousness is like. And it's like this whenever you remember to look. So it's the repeatability of it that is significant. So what's important to realize is that the selflessness I'm talking about is not a peak experience that you have and then lose and then remember for the rest of your life and think about and hope to get back to. No, it is a capacity to notice something about the nature of consciousness in every present moment, the moment you remember to look, the moment you remember that there's an alternative to being lost in thought, which is to say, in a moment of mindfulness. So you can either locate this quality of consciousness in this moment, or you can't. And if you can, well then it's always there to be inspected. So if you think yourself up into a position of doubt about this, and you wonder, well, maybe there really is a self, and maybe I'm just fooling myself, well then you can look again in this moment. And if you actually have this capacity to look, well then this feeling of self will again drop away. Then its absence will become obvious. So it is self-authenticating in that sense. It's a direct insight that is repeatable. So again, it's not a question of whether you are remembering this thing correctly. You know, maybe the thing you thought happened to you really didn't happen to you. There's no way to go back and check. Okay, no, this is in every present moment something that can be recognized about the nature of consciousness. Why do people keep claiming incorrectly that Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot were atheists? Well, what's incorrect about the claim is that they were motivated by atheism. That the idea that there is no God was the reason they created all the suffering and mayhem that they did. Some of them probably were atheists. I certainly think that Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot were atheists. Hitler seems to have believed a fair amount of religious nonsense, as you know, and famously referred to Jesus throughout his speeches. Whether he was actually a Christian or not, I don't know, but the crucial point is that the behavior of someone like Stalin, creating gulags and sending intellectuals there and presiding over the starvation of his people, etc., was not an expression of atheism as a set of ideas. Whereas when people are murdered for blasphemy or apostasy in a Muslim society, this is a direct expression of a religious ideology. Now, if Hitler gave speech after speech detailing how his rejection of God and his certainty that there was no heaven or hell was leading him to behave in the way that he did, if he kept saying, I'm going to kill the Jews because I hate them as a source of Abrahamic religion, and I'm an atheist, and I'm opposed to all religion, okay, if that was the content of his conversation, well, then yes, we could draw a line between his beliefs and his behavior. And we might wonder whether there's a necessary connection between a rejection of God and this kind of behavior. But at the very least, we would be able to say that the conscious adoption of atheism in this context was leading him to behave this way. But of course, that was not the character of his conversation at all. And his hatred of the Jews was a rather direct inheritance from 2,000 years of Christian demagoguery. And everything else he was committed to, this whole notion of the purity of German blood and everything else, amounted to a quasi-religious mythology. All of the other trappings of Nazism, the personality cult of the Third Reich, had many of the features of a religion, as did life under Stalin or Pol Pot, and the same is true of North Korea now. These are quasi-religious mass movements. These are political religions. The problem is not that there is too much skepticism or too much of a commitment to empirical reality. And as I've said before on this topic, and I think it really does cover it, there's no society in human history that ever suffered because its people became too reasonable, too committed to evidence and argument. And that's all you need to know to put this canard to rest. How do you stay so cool all the time? I don't think I've ever seen you raise your voice in an argument. Well, I'm not a yeller, but I'm certainly not cool all the time. In my latest book, Waking Up, I give a few examples where I've lost my cool. But in public debate, I think it's important to remain strictly rational and honest, and getting pissed off is generally not an asset. At least it's not one for me. Now, I should say, however, that I think outrage is sometimes warranted and can be very useful to express, the way Hitch often did. And there are many encounters I've had where it would have been great to have traded places with Hitch and just have swapped him in tag team style for a much-deserved application of fire and brimstone. But I think Hitch probably did this to a fault. I think it made him seem like a less reliable interlocutor than he in fact was on many topics. But in many cases, I do think his application of anger was spot on, and I wish it was a gear I had that I could shift into. If I have it, I haven't found it yet. Because I'm working in a different mode in conversations of this kind. I'm just trying to get out of the way and track what is true. But that's not to say that I never get angry. And it just doesn't tend to happen in face-to-face encounters about ideas. It'll happen behind the keyboard more than it will happen behind the mic. And part of this is there is something about face-to-face encounters that make it difficult to demonize one's opponent, and I think that's a good thing. I'm very aware that when one is colliding with some odious person online, purely through the vehicle of text, it's possible to be arguing with someone who only exists in your imagination. And needless to say, I've been on the receiving end of this kind of thing, and it's incredibly annoying. When you're just behind the keyboard, you don't get any of the social cues that would allow you to empathize with your opponent or at a minimum go halfway toward understanding his position. So you can wind up manufacturing an enemy and attacking him for views that he doesn't actually hold. And what you say in that context, or write, will not be constrained by whatever he would have said in real time to correct your distortion of his views. Now this is why so much debate online is just totally unproductive. Is your primary motive in criticizing religion to uphold the truth, ensure that no harm comes, or something else entirely? Well, it's both of the first two things. I certainly want to believe things that are true, that is to have my beliefs track reality insofar as we can understand it. And I also want to minimize the specific harms that would otherwise be unthinkable but for the crazy things that people believe in the name of religion. And in fact, the most important things that anyone has ever gotten out of religion, the experience of self-transcendence or unconditional love, these states of consciousness exist or not and can be experienced or not based on a very direct empirical exploration of our own mental life. And such inquiry does not require belief in anything, other than that it would be worth exploring consciousness directly to see what it's like. And there are methods for doing this, and they simply do not depend upon faith. So it's my sense that religion has poisoned and obscured the only resource it ever had in the first place, the contemplative life, that also makes me eager to criticize it. Can you comment on your spat with Noam Chomsky? Your initial critique of him in The End of Faith, do you stand by it? I'm a big fan, but I just don't get this. Well, I'm not aware of having a spat with him. He's actually taken a few shots at me online, but we've never met, and I'm not aware of him having read The End of Faith or having noticed what I've said about his politics. So to some degree, we could just be talking on parallel channels here. But I just think there is a kind of moral confusion expressed in his political writing which ignores intention as a basis upon which to evaluate certain human behavior. At the end of the day, he simply wants to use body count as the only metric to discuss the moral stature of two sides in a conflict. So if we kill a dozen children unintentionally, well, that's every bit as bad as doing it intentionally. That, I think, is a bad way to look at human conflict. I think the people who are intending to kill children are different than the people who are intending to kill the people who are killing children and are accidentally killing children in the process. It's a huge difference. You have to ask yourself, well, what kind of world does any group or society want to create? How do they want the world to be? And what would they do if they had all the power? And when you ask that question, you get very different answers for specific groups, no matter how much misery and death is happening on both sides of a conflict. And when you look at World War II, it was just a horrific wastage of human life. But the difference between the Allies and the Nazis was absolutely categorical. What sort of world did the Third Reich want to create? Okay? And what did we want to create on our side? We did horrible things. The firebombing of Dresden, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Absolutely grotesque acts of violence, where hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people over the course of the war, died. But what sort of world were we trying to build? What were our intentions with respect to the Germans and the Japanese, really? Well, you saw our intentions, because after the war, we did not murder everyone. We helped rebuild their societies. So we're not perfect, but we were different from the Nazis. So you can't just look to body count, merely, to judge the rightness or wrongness of human behavior. And Chomsky seems to discount intentions across the board and only look at body count. And if you do that in any given instance, you come away with a perverse description of what's happening in the world. And you come away believing the kinds of things that people influenced by Chomsky tend to believe, whether it's Glenn Greenwald or any other person who's drunk this Kool-Aid. And you can end up saying things like, the United States is the greatest terrorist state in human history, right? Or some other such nonsense. There is a difference between the Dick Cheneys of the world and the al-Baghdadis of the world. And it is crucial that people on the left understand that. And as far as I can tell, Chomsky has been a source of pure moral confusion on this point. What is your biggest regret and why? Well, I don't actually spend a lot of time regretting things. It doesn't make a lot of psychological sense to me. You know, if you get me focused on a specific thing I did in the past where the outcome wasn't good, well then I can certainly wish that I had made a different decision or that my life had taken a different turn there. But everything that has happened, everything that I did or didn't do has conspired to produce precisely this moment. And it seems to me that the only reasonable use of my attention now is to figure out how to navigate forward from here towards some desirable end. But there are things in my past which I certainly think were not optimal and I wish I had done differently. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is dropping out of college as an undergraduate. I took 11 years off between my sophomore and junior year at Stanford. And Stanford is one of the only schools, I think, where you can actually do this. And this has allowed me to do many things that I certainly don't regret and that were incredibly valuable for me. I spent about 2 years on silent retreat in my 20s, and I read hundreds of good books, and I spent a fair amount of time writing, so it's not that I wasted all that time, but I didn't appreciate the difference between dropping out as an undergraduate and taking time off between college and graduate school. But psychologically, it seems to me the difference is huge. And I remember spending 1, 2, 3 years more dimly realizing that I wanted to go back to school and wanted to go to graduate school and feeling just unable to do it because I just felt too old to go back and finish my undergraduate degree. It was just embarrassing to be that old as an undergraduate. And so at a certain point I just realized I had to do it, and I was 30 at the time, and at that point I really wished I had realized this at 25. Or better still, I wished I had taken the break between college and graduate school. So when people write me, asking me advice about their academic careers, and people who are wondering about whether to drop out of school, and they're trying to use my career as an example about how to plot their course, I'm really adamant on this point. I mean, you can basically do anything you want and still finish school. You can say, if you want to sit 3 months a year on a retreat, you can do that in your summers. And from that point on, then you can decide how you want to further your education and whether there's some career open to you that doesn't require more school. But dropping out, I think, is a bad idea, because you're not in a position to know how hard it's going to be psychologically to go back and finish. And this was something I was blindsided by, because I felt for a very long time that I was playing catch-up in a way that was stressful, and it's not something I would wish on any of you. So stay in school. And with that, I conclude another podcast.
Okay, thank you for watching, and thank you for going through the whole thing. If you'd like to support my channel, you can do that by going to Patreon and sign up for $1 or $5. If you do a $5 Patreon, you can actually become a lucky owner of one small painting, which is a Patreon giveaway that I do every month. So sign up and support your artist, and I see you in the next video. Keep painting, keep living, and have fun.